Okay, we carry on. Daniel. Now, last week, if you were here, I provided some historical background. I just like that. I think it's important for us to have a sense of the historical setting of what's going on. I provided that background. I explained that after defeating the Egyptians at this famous Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, that the then crown prince Nebuchadnezzar, he would become king later that year, but he pursued the Egyptian troops southward, and at that time he besieged Jerusalem, and he took tribute from King Jehoiakim in the form of both people and cultic articles. Now, this was the king who had been put on the throne by Pharaoh Necho, but Jehoiakim, he was allowed by Nebuchadnezzar to remain on the throne, but now he would be a Babylonian vassal. He would be a Babylonian puppet king. But some 7 years later, he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, which brings an assault. Nebuchadnezzar comes back in 598, 597, and he attacks Jerusalem at that time. And right around then, that's when Jehoiakim, the nerve of the guy, he rebels. Here comes Nebuchadnezzar, and he dies. And then his son, Jehoiakim, assumes the throne, but he stays there just for a few months because he sees the handwritings on the wall. He surrenders promptly to spare Jerusalem. He knows what's going to happen. And then he is taken into Babylonian captivity, and he lives a long life in Babylonian captivity. And as I pointed out last week, after Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562 BC, he then is released by evil Merodach, and he eats at the king's table. And right when we ended, I pointed out that we've discovered the Babylonian administrative tablets that from 592 BC that give the rations that the Babylonians provided to this specific king, Jehoiakim there. Well, after taking Jehoiakim captive, Nebuchadnezzar installed Josiah's son Mattaniah on the throne of Judah and gives him the throne name Zedekiah. And then Zedekiah, about 10 years later, he too rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, and that brings the ferocious assault of 587, 586, where Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed. Okay, so you have Daniel going in exile in 605. You have another assault in 598, 597. Then you have the big one in 587, 586, where Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed. Okay, so that's kind of the overall setting. Daniel's already in Babylonian captivity from 605. Now, Daniel, just a little bit about him. Verse 6 of chapter 1 identifies Daniel as one of the youths taken from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar to be trained for service in the king's palace. That's why he's taken. And he was probably in his early teens when he was taken. And according to verses 3 and 4 of chapter 1, he was from the royal family or the nobility. He had a good appearance. He was intelligent, and he was well educated. So what Nebuchadnezzar has had brought to him is what we would call the cream of the Israelite crop. That's who's coming here to be groomed and prepared for service in the king's palace. Now, the prophet Ezekiel, who himself was taken into Babylonian captivity in that second assault on Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 598, 597. Okay, so some 7 years after Daniel had been taken. We have Ezekiel himself is taken, and Ezekiel speaks of a Daniel who was known for righteousness, wisdom, and the ability to unravel secrets. You see that in Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 14, chapter 14, verse 20, chapter 28, verse 3. And even though Ezekiel spells Daniel slightly differently, the description that he gives seems clearly to fit the picture of Daniel that we get from the book of Daniel. Now, the dated prophecies of Ezekiel, they fall between 593 BC and 571. So that's the dated prophecies there. And he speaks highly of a Daniel who seems to fit the Daniel of this book. So apparently Daniel was highly esteemed by the Jews from very early in his life. So that's something about the person Daniel. Then we get into chapter 1 of the book. Daniel and three other youths from the tribe of Judah, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So you have these four young men, these young teens, are brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar's chief eunuch, his chief official, a man named Ashpenaz, and he's brought there. He does that pursuant to Nebuchadnezzar's order. And all of these boys, these four Judean boys, they are all from what we would say the Israelite cream of the crop. They're all characterized by what you see in verses 3 and 4. Now, as a footnote, in 2007, a man named Michael Jersa, who at that time was an associate professor at the University of Vienna, he was searching the British Museum for Babylonian financial records. That's what academics do. They do that kind of thing. So he was doing that. And he deciphered the cuneiform inscription on a small tablet. This tablet had been discovered in the 1870s, purchased by the British Museum in 1920. And in 2007, this guy Jersa is looking around and he's looking for these Babylonian financial accounts. And he translates this and sees that it is a receipt dated to the 10th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. So it's from 595 to 594 in that year of his reign. And it is a receipt for a gift of gold that was made to a temple in Babylon located about a mile from the modern city of Baghdad. And the donor identified on this receipt of gold that was made to this temple is Nebo-Sarsechem, Nebuchadnezzar's chief eunuch. Now, this guy Nebo-Sarsechem is identified by name in Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 3. Okay, you'll have to look at the New English Translation, the NIV, and maybe some others to see that. But he's identified by name there. But this find, it's also relevant to Daniel because it confirms that there was an office of chief eunuch in Nebuchadnezzar's administration, as mentioned in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. So Ashpenaz, he's the chief eunuch who oversaw Daniel's training. And then by the 10th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he had been replaced by Nebo-Sarsechem. A guy named Brian Wendell, he says, the Nebo-Sarsechem tablet not only confirms the biblical person mentioned by Jeremiah, it also affirms the title chief eunuch used in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. According to Michael Jersa, references to the title of chief eunuch are very rare in the ancient sources. Thus, Daniel likely knew two chief eunuchs in Babylon, Ashpenaz, who oversaw his training, and Nebo-Sarsechem, who held the role a decade later. And I just think to me, it's just amazing. You know, like we find an artifact, we find a tablet that identifies this guy, but then earlier we have the tablet that shows the rations that are being given to this Judean king in Babylonian exile. And so I see God's hand working in these kinds of things. Now it's noted in verse 2 of Daniel chapter 1 that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. So you see what is going on. This is God's judgment of Judah. When it says he gave him into his hand, God is already bringing judgment on Judah through the Babylonians. That's what's happening. He is beginning to punish Judah. This is the first of three deportations, as I just indicated. 605, 598, 597, 587, 586. So God is doing this. He's beginning his punishment of Judah. He'd been begging them, pleading with them. They reject him. So, okay, here come the Babylonians. But he does it incrementally. He does it in stages to give them the maximum opportunity to repent. But they will not. They will not repent. And as we know, they wouldn't do that. And that leads to the absolute catastrophe of 587, 586, which you can read about. It's mourned powerfully in the book of Lamentations, how horrific this was. An 18-month siege of the city, and then its ultimate destruction. Now Daniel and his companions, they were brought to Babylon to be prepared to serve in the king's palace. And as verses 4 and 5 indicate, this involved them in being educated for, quote, 3 years. I'll say more about that in a second. But being educated for 3 years in the language and literature of the Chaldeans, after which time their suitability to serve in the king's palace would be assessed by the king. So they're being trained up. You've got this group of people. They're being put through their paces. They're the cream of the crop. They come here, they're being trained, and then the king's going to assess them after that and see who makes the cut. Who is worthy to serve then in the king's palace. Now, if Chaldeans is here used broadly, and I think it is, if it's here used broadly, then their training would include their learning the traditional language of Akkadian, which was very complicated writing, but it would include that. Now the king assigned to them a daily portion of the food he ate and drank. Right now, which in his eyes is of course the best. He is king. He's the king of the Babylonian Empire. The stuff he gets is top shelf, or he wouldn't be getting it. Okay, so you have to see how he looks at this. He assigns for them food, meat, and wine that comes from his table. That's what he gets. So he's thinking it's clearly the best. So naturally he assumed, as suggested in verse 10, that the food and drink that he has, that would be the most beneficial for the health and the conditioning of his prospective servants. Right? I mean, his stuff is the best. So naturally it's going to be the best to give to those who are in training to be his servants. Now each of the 4 men who are mentioned, who were taken from Jerusalem, who were taken into captivity, they're each given a Babylonian name. Right? Daniel is given the name Belteshazzar. Hananiah is called Shadrach. Mishael is called Meshach. Azariah is given the name Abednego. They're all given Babylonian names. And this renaming is no doubt designed to help pull them into Babylonian culture. Right? It's designed to help pull them this way, to weaken their identification with their homeland, their identification with Judah and with God. Because in fact, all of their names in some way related to God. So it's just part of converting them and making them Babylonians, bringing them into the Babylon and detaching them from their roots. So they're given a different name. And verse 8 says that Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. That he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. He was concerned about, when it says defile himself, clearly Daniel is concerned that God does not want him. God prohibits for some reason and in some way his consuming the meat and the wine that the king was providing. Because he thinks that in my doing it, it will defile him. And you think there's been a lot of talk about, well, what's behind this? What exactly is concerning Daniel about eating this? Well, we're not sure. There's probably a combination of things. Okay, the Old Testament prohibited Israelites from eating certain kinds of meat. In other words, there's certain kinds of meat simply out of bounds for you. Right? You can see that in Leviticus 11, Leviticus 20, 25, Deuteronomy 14, 3 through 21. So it prohibits them from eating certain kinds of meat, but it also prohibits them from eating any meat that is not slaughtered so as to drain the blood. Okay, so there's some meat that's off limits altogether. But any meat is off limits if it's not properly prepared. And you see that. You see that in Leviticus 17, 10 to 16, 19, 26, Deuteronomy 12, 15 to 25. So to avoid the risk of doing so, and probably also to avoid the risk of consuming meat that had been offered in worship of an idol. Okay, now you can see how a Jew, that's not spelled out in the Old Testament, but you can see how Jews would think that was an implication of God's hatred of idol worship, so that they could come to a conviction, a conscience matter, that God does not want me to participate or eat what has been used in the worship of an idol. So I think you both have with regard to the meat, you have the Old Testament prohibitions, but you also probably have this sensitivity that God does not want me to share in meat that was offered to an idol. And that's probably what's behind his refusal of drinking the wine from the king's table. Because there's no prohibition of that in the Old Testament, like you have the prohibition of certain kinds of meat and meat that's not slaughtered in a certain way. And yet he says, I'm not going to drink the wine because I think doing that will be defiling. And what I think is probably happening there is he fears that just like the meat as part of his opposition to eating the meat, the wine may have been used in the worship of an idol. And I don't want to take the king's wine. I don't want to eat his meat, or I don't want to drink his wine. All I want is water and I want vegetables. You say, well, how about the vegetables? Isn't there a risk that the vegetables had been used in idol worship? And I think that's possible, but I just have to think that Daniel must have known, or may have known, something about the source of these particular vegetables, that he could eat them with a clear conscience. But what I do know is he's saying, I'm not eating the meat and the wine from the king's table because that would be defiling to me. So he says, look, he makes up his mind not to do that. Now, in Daniel chapter 10, verses 2 and 3, there it implies that Daniel had no problem eating meat and drinking wine later in his life. But you see, the source of that food and drink is not specified. Here we know where it's coming from. There in chapter 10 of 3, the implication that he has no problem eating meat and drinking wine later in life, the source isn't specified, and that was after Cyrus had decreed, after the Persian king Cyrus had defeated the Babylonians, and he had decreed that the Israelites could return home. So it's reasonable to think that at that time there was a clear supply of non-defiling meat and wine. Okay, so it's a different situation. I think what's going on here is what I've just laid out for you. But clearly, what's not debatable or vague is the idea. He says, I'm not eating the meat, I'm not drinking wine, because he resolved not to defile himself. And Daniel asked the chief of the eunuchs, because this is his conviction, he doesn't want to do this in his service to God. He wants to keep clean before God in his heart and spirit. He goes to the chief of the eunuchs, he asks them to allow him not to defile himself, meaning relieve me from eating the meat and the wine that is supplied by the king for his prospective servants. Allow me not to eat and drink that. So he goes to him and he asks that, but the chief of the eunuchs refused to grant that request because he feared that he would be killed. This is how it was in the ancient world. This was who the king was. If the king decided, if I don't give you the meat and the wine the king provided for you, the king's saying this is top shelf, this is certainly going to be the best, and you suffer. And then the king finds out that he looks and says, you're not doing as well as other people, and he finds out that I did not give you The food, the meat and the wine that he provided for you, he will kill me. And we might be getting there, well, maybe he can litigate. Maybe he can, maybe he can file a suit and get an injunction. Forget it. This guy knows. He says, look, you're a nice guy. But if you think I'm going to risk being killed by the king for you, you're crazy. Okay, so he says, look, he's not going to do that. He's not going to let that happen. Now, the statement there in verse 9, where it says, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, that does not mean, obviously, that he agreed and allowed Daniel to abstain from the king's meat and wine. He clearly didn't. He said, no, what are you, crazy? I'm not going to risk being killed by the king. It refers to the fact that the chief eunuch didn't perceive Daniel's request to be an act of rebellion or defiance. He gave him favor in that when he requested that, the chief of the eunuchs granted his good faith in asking. That it was truly a conscience matter. It was something he's trying to do between him and his God. Okay? Because if he had thought that Daniel was trying to stir up trouble and trying to be rebellious, he would have punished Daniel. Okay, so that's what I think he's talking about there. Then in verses 11 to 16, Daniel then approaches a lesser official. See, the chief of the eunuchs said, Daniel just comes in and says, hey, let me get out of this. And he says, you're crazy. No. So then Daniel goes to a lesser official. He goes to the steward the chief eunuch had put in charge of, assigned to them. He comes there with a new plan. And see, rather than just saying outright, rather than a permanent change, he asked only for a 10-day trial. So he comes to the steward and he says, look, let's just try it for 10 days. And then at the end of 10 days, very short period of time, you can make the assessment. And if you see that I'm deteriorating at all, you can nip it in the bud. You can catch it before the king could see anything, and we can go back on the program. Okay? So I'm removing your risk or minimizing your risk in this. So let's just try it 10 days, and then you see how it goes. And so the steward agrees to the test. He listens, he agrees to the test. And Daniel and his 3 companions are given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And at the end of only 10 days, they are more healthy looking than all the other youths who ate the king's food. So they're looking better than they are. So the steward then says, all right, this is working. So he then continued to take away from them the king's meat and the king's wine, and to allow them to go on without defiling their consciences, to allow them to continue on with only vegetables and water. Now, the implication of this is not what some vegetarians want to throw out and say, this proves that vegetarianism is better. That's not it at all. The implication is that God rewarded the faithfulness of the young men. They were willing to do something to stand for God. They said, for me to do this would defile me. And you go, do you understand where you are? Why don't you just shut up and go along? I can't do it. I can't do it. I got to try to find a way that I can live with a clear conscience before God. And for that reason, God honored them and blessed them. Now, God grants the 4 Jewish youths, He grants them learning, skill in all literature, and wisdom. God is giving this to them. And He also grants Daniel understanding in all visions and dreams. And the entire group of candidates, they're all taken before King Nebuchadnezzar and interviewed by him. And we have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They stood out above all the others. God has blessed them with this learning and this wisdom, so that when they're tested, when the king is trying things out and saying who really has, on the ball, who's worthy of serving, they stand out above all the other people, and they're chosen to serve the king. And verse 20 is probably a general statement. like a statement about how things turned out. Okay, it's a general statement that over the years of their service, they proved to be 10 times better. Now, I smell in 10 times better. I don't smell a mathematical formula. Okay, I smell a way of saying they were really, really good. Okay, they were 10 times better. It's like when you say the guy hit the ball a mile, right? It's simply, I suspect, this is just a way of phrasing things to say, look, they're 10 times better in matters of wisdom and understanding than all the advisors. They were way better, head and shoulders better. I don't think it's a mathematical thing, but better than the magicians and the enchanters that were in the kingdom. And as I say, this is borne out by what follows. They were awesome at what they were doing. And verse 21 notes that Daniel served in the court of the Babylonian kings for as long as there were Babylonian kings. Okay? That is, he served until the first year of the Persian king Cyrus, who conquered the Babylonians. So he's from Nebuchadnezzar all the way through. Okay, until Cyrus the Persian is there, which is in 539, 538 BC. So he serves out for as long as there are Babylonian kings to serve. And so if Daniel was, say, 14 when he was taken into captivity in 605, maybe arriving there in 604, he would have been in his early 80s when he retired from royal service. So that's a long life of serving. All right, chapter 2. The second year of Nebuchadnezzar, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as king, he's troubled by dreams. We'll talk about a lot in a second. But I first want to deal with a chronology question. He's troubled by dreams. Daniel chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 indicate that by this time, Daniel and his companions, they had already been accepted as servants of the king, since they're included among the wise men who were to be killed. Okay, so the question is how they could have had, quote, 3 years of training prior to being accepted into Nebuchadnezzar's service, pursuant to chapter 1, verse 5. How could they have had 3 years of training prior to being accepted in his service, and it still only be the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign? Okay? I address these things sometimes just because you'll run across them and people will try to make hay about them, trying to disturb you. Okay? So consider this a little side trip. It'll be short. But the answer is here. You see, the answer is that the Babylonians, they counted the first full year of a king's reign as the first year of his reign. It's not just when he started. It's the first full year of his reign that's the first year. Whereas Jews and other people in the ancient Near East generally, they normally included partial years when they're counting time spans. You remember when we were talking about Jesus being in the tomb 3 days, part of Friday, all of Saturday, part of Sunday, part. I talked about, that was just a convention. That was how it was said. If any part of the day was the day. So it's 3 days. That's how it was. That's how it was in the ancient Near East. So Nebuchadnezzar, for example, he would have reigned for 1 year before what is called the first year of his reign, because he reigned for part of the year before he reigned for the first full year. All right, and then the training of the Jewish boys began in the partial year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign that preceded his first full year. That's the first year of his reign. And at the end, they would have ended during the second full year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. I hope you can see that from here. Here's what Andrew Steinman in his commentary says about it. He says, since it was normal for people in the ancient Near East to count partial years when reckoning time spans, the Judeans would have been in training during part of Nebuchadnezzar's accession year. Okay, that's what we would call his first year, but it wasn't a full year of serving. So it was his accession year, which is followed by the first year of his reign. All right, so it would have been during part of Nebuchadnezzar's accession year, his entire first year, and part of his second year. All right, so they're during his accession year, his first full year, and then part of his second year. Okay, so that's how you get to the 3 years, making 3 years according to Hebrew count, fulfilling the 3 years in chapter 1, verse 5. Thus, the notice of the events of chapter 2 took place in Nebuchadnezzar's second year, implies that it was shortly after Daniel and his companions had completed their training. So that's the point. And I said this is kind of a footnote, but I know you'll see these things and run into them. I want you to at least heard something. Oh, I know there was somebody who said something that's not a problem. If you remember that, I'm happy. And then you can go dig around and find out what it is. But if you'll just remember when somebody says, oh, no, that's all bad, Bible's crazy, that's not a problem. Okay? It fits from people who know a lot more about it than I do. All right, now in 603 to 602, when Daniel's still a teenager, Nebuchadnezzar has this disturbing, troubling dream. So he summons his advisors, these people who were thought to have insight into such matters. So this bothered him. This really bothered him. So he's knowing something's going on. And so he gathers the people he thinks have insight into such things, the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, there's that word again. The Chaldeans, in the hope that they could interpret the dream for him. Now here, Chaldeans is used in a specialized sense. If you remember last week, I talked about there was a region that was Chaldea, but Chaldeans was used generally to refer to Babylonians. But here we have a specialized sense. In the New English translation, the note in the New English translation says the term Chaldeans is used in the book of Daniel both in an ethnic sense and as here to refer to a caste of Babylonian wise men and astrologers. And it also looks like probably that it's used as a collective for the other categories of enchanters and sorcerers, magicians, this kind of stuff. You can either think that it's a fourth one, you can have there's 4, 1, 2, or it's like these 3, the Chaldeans representing all of them. Okay, on that point, here's what Andrew Steinman says. He says, in this context, Chaldeans seems to be a general word that covers all 3 classes of diviners previously mentioned. Okay, so you could either have it as a 4th separate category, or you can have it as that is, we have A, B, C, that is the Chaldeans. Okay, so it could be a group term, and I think that's probably likely. It says, thus in chapter 2, verse 4, the Chaldeans who replied to the king include the 3 other kinds of diviners, the magicians, soothsayers, and sorcerers named in chapter 2, verse 2. So I think that's probably right. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he announces, so he's troubled. He gathers the people he thinks are going to have insight into this, going to be able to help him get the answer that he wants. And he announces to the assembled counselors and advisors that he had a disturbing dream and he wants to know what it means. Okay, so here you are before this king, and the king who says, if the king wants you dead, you're dead. And he calls you in and he's got a troubling dream and he wants the answer to it. He wants to know what's going on. Now the Chaldeans said, they tell the king, we will tell you the interpretation of the dream after you give us the dream. All right? Okay, you got all these wise men here, these people. Sure, okay. All right, we hear you. You're disturbed. You want to know what this dream means? Okay, tell us the dream and we'll help you out. We will tell you what it means. And Nebuchadnezzar's having none of it. Okay, so he tells them they were either going to tell him both the dream and its interpretation, or they were going to be ripped apart and their homes destroyed. Okay, so now you tell us a dream. He said, you're going to tell me the dream, and you're going to tell me its interpretation. You're going to tell me the dream, or you're going to be killed and your house is going to be destroyed. On the other hand, if you're able to tell me the dream and its interpretation, well, there's going to be great reward in it for you. So that's how he sets it up. And they again ask the king to tell him the dream. Right? They want, no, hey, you tell us the dream, and we'll fill you in on what it means. But he told them their fate was sealed if they did not do what he commanded. Their fate was sealed. He was sufficiently bothered by the dream, you see. This was so disturbing to him that he wanted to be sure that he received the real meaning of the dream. It was that important to him. And he wanted to know that he received the meaning. And to make sure that he was receiving the real meaning of the dream, he was requiring them to demonstrate their insight by discerning something regarding which he could gauge their accuracy. It's a test for them. You guys are always telling me you got insight, you got this and that. Okay, this is so important to me. You're going to have to demonstrate to me that you do in fact have such insight, because knowing the meaning of this dream is that important to me. Okay, so here's how it's going to go. I know the meaning of the dream. You're going to have to tell me the meaning of the dream. Now, once you tell me the meaning of the dream, I will then know that you do in fact have insight into certain matters, and I can then rest assured that you have insight into the interpretation. But if you cannot tell me the meaning of the dream, then I think you're a fraud. Okay? That's what's going on. In verse 9 he says, he says in verse 9, tell me the dream that I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. This is what he wants. He wants objective verification that they do in fact have insight, so that he can rely on their interpretation. Now the Chaldeans protested. They said that no one on earth could do that, and that no king had ever demanded such a thing from any diviner. That's something that only the gods could show the king. That was beyond their pay grade. They couldn't do that. Only the gods could do that. And that was not the response the king wanted. That is not the response he wanted. Now, he no doubt felt that this proved that they had been frauds all along. You know, he's got this whole court, he's got all these people, they're always telling him stuff. When it came down to it, and he said, you're going to have to prove to me that you have insight into these things so I can trust you, they punted. When they punted, he decided, you're all fakes. Okay? You can't do this. You're all frauds. And he ordered that all the wise men be killed. That's what motivated that. He says, I'm through with all of you. It's all nonsense. You've been lying to me. And so he orders that they all be killed. And when Arioch, the king of the captain of the king's guard, when Arioch, he's been assigned to carry out the executions. When he comes to Daniel and his companions, who also, because they were wise men, were slated for execution, they say, well, why weren't they part of the original group that went there? Well, you know how politics works. None of this is spelled out. But that doesn't surprise me at all. I can see the kings, all the people grown up, they all know, they're here together, and we've had these Jews brought over. They've been trained up. They're rookies. And so they've been admitted into the king's service. But when it comes to the king summons people, I can see them icing these guys out. But when it comes to killing them, they're not going to ice them out. They're going to include them. Okay, so obviously Daniel's not there because he doesn't know what's going on. Arioch comes to carry out the king's execution orders, and Daniel speaks to him wisely, with prudence, you see. He doesn't sit there and say, what are you doing? I got rights. You got no right to kill me. All right, he doesn't do that. Now what happens? See, because Daniel, he then gets him to reveal, because Daniel wasn't there, he says, what's behind this? Why is the king wanting to kill all the wise men? And he then explains it to him. So he explains that to him, and Daniel replies that way. He gets the response back from Arioch, and then Daniel goes in and he goes into the king. So he goes in, he goes into the king, and when it says that, I doubt it means that Daniel just walked into the king. When it says Daniel goes into the king, I suspect what it means is that he, through a senior official, through some kind of channel, went in there and asked the king to give him time, to set a time to interpret the dream. In other words, Daniel goes in and he's saying, I'm not quarreling with your conditions. I'm not looking to get out from under the condition that I tell you the dream and its interpretation. All I need is time. So you set the time. You set the time, and your conditions will be complied with. So what that functions as a stay of execution. Because Nebuchadnezzar says to that, okay, all right, whatever time, here you got till this time, you come in, you tell me the dream and its interpretation. And so at the time Daniel made that request, he had no idea what the king had dreamed. Right? He didn't have any idea of that. He only knew that the situation was desperate, and that God knows all things, and he can reveal to people what he chooses. That's what Daniel knew. So he goes and says, hey, you set a time, we'll get you what you're after. And he does that. And he went home and he informed the three companions of the situation, and he urged them to seek God's mercy, to pray to God, to ask God to grant him the insight that he needs, that they all might be spared. He doesn't know what the dream is, but he calls his buddies and says, let's beseech God in prayer that he will give us this. Because we're on the brink. We're going to get killed along with all the wise men. And so that's what they do. They do that he will give us the content and the meaning of the dream. And the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. It was revealed in a vision that night. And Daniel very powerfully praises God for his mercy in doing that. In verses 20 to 23. And Lord willing, next week. Thanks.